In this section of the lesson on reserving and preserving whites, we're going to talk about probably the most commonly used method, which is to simply paint around them. You'll need a 1/16 sheet of watercolor paper, which you've divided up into 6 sections, leaving a little space in between as usual. You'll also need your usual watercolor setup, and if you have a flat brush, you may find that useful in this exercise. If you have a little circle template, you may find that useful, but neither of those is absolutely necessary. In the first square, I'm going to just draw a little fake city skyscraper skyline, leaving some gaps here and there, making these mostly rectangular shapes. Don't overthink it. You'll see in a minute that my main reason for doing this is just so we can see how to paint around an angular series of shapes. In the next one, take your circle template, make a circle, and then give it a little smile. So I have a little, sort of a little Pac-Man type figure with a curved smile. In this one, I'm going to make your basic 70s style flower shape. In this one, make a letter such as the letter A, a block letter, and we're going to make a letter with some thickness to it. If you like to make balloon lettering, you could do a balloon letter too, bubble lettering. And then we'll figure out what we're doing in these two when we get, and we're not going to draw on those just yet. So, suppose my sky is dark and my buildings are lighter. Say if the sun is behind me shining on these buildings at the end of the day. So I might want to paint a deep violet sky behind my buildings. And if I use a flat brush, because the flat brush makes these shapes easily, it will make my job less challenging than if I have to do this with a round brush. So I'm going to lay a wash, and I can go this way or I can go this way, whichever seems easier to me. For something like this, it seems easier for me to get in between these buildings going this way. But if this were a big sheet of paper, I might be laying my wash this way to do my sky. In fact, I might start with a different brush and be laying my wash like this. But then when I reach this point where I have to go around these buildings, this would be a good time to switch to the brush that makes those shapes just naturally. Makes my life much easier. One thing you have to watch out for is the paint is collecting in those little inlets, so I might want to tip my page and start my wash here if it's a big sheet. This works even if I only want to have certain parts of this a complete white. I may be tinting some of this later, so we'll let that dry and we may come back to that. If you have something that has round edges and little tight points, then a round brush might be the easiest. And I'm going to start with the most difficult part first, so that I don't have things drying out here while I'm trying to do that little difficult spot. Now, that wants to start drying while I'm working, so I have to work both directions. And that makes this more of a challenge. But if I turn it around at this point and let gravity help me, then I can establish a bead on both sides. And now once I have it to this point, the bead will allow me to slow down and paint around my shape. Because I have a nice bead, I don't have to worry about this drying while I'm working. And now it's just like laying any other wash. Now this one's going to be more difficult. I would still need to do the same thing and keep it going all the way around, but I've got these troublesome spots all the way around, and I only have 5 petals here. If this had 30 petals, it would really be a challenge. So one option would be to mask this with a resist. But often, if you just think about your design a little bit, you can arrange things so that you don't have that problem and you have a more interesting painting. What if there were a leaf that came off this way and perhaps another leaf that came off this way? Now the background is broken up into 2 separate sections, and I'd be able to do those 2 separate sections more easily. Let's see, I'm going to do this side first because that paint is still wet. So now I only have to do this area, and it's not too difficult for me to do those 3 little tight spots because they're all sort of at the same angle. So if you have a large area that you have to cover with a wash and you have to paint around a complex shape, see if there are ways that you can use your design to break things up so that you don't have that problem. Very often it's a more interesting design anyway. You may recall when we laid the graduated washes that one method that we had was to wet the entire page first to help the color move. We can use that same thing in a smaller area. I'm going to wet everything except the letters. And I'm actually going to put a little bit of color into my water so that you can see where I'm putting it. If you're using clear water, because there's no pigment in it, you don't have to worry about something drying and making a hard edge. I have to work quickly enough that I get that uniform film of water where everything is wet except the 2 letters. And I'm going to come back and worry about these 3 center blobs later. But everything else is uniformly wet. No dry spots, no drippy spots. And now I start dropping this color in and allowing it to move. And because this paper is dry, it moves only up to the edge of the letters and not into the dry areas. Furthermore, because the paper's wet, I have lots of time to work before I have to worry about my wash starting to dry and get streaky. Then in the end, I come back and clean up those edges, make sure I get them the way I wanted them, but I have lots of time to work here because nothing is drying too fast on me. And now that I've done all the outside, I can come back and fill these little spaces with a matching color. I bet you thought that would be really hard to do, but it's not. And of course, it doesn't have to be lettering. It could be any sort of small white shape that you need to surround with color. You can use this method. Now, what if I need kind of a frilly look? I want to leave some little glints of white, but I don't want to leave large white areas. One way to handle this is to use a resist and spatter it or put it on with banding film. But another way to handle this is to work into the frilly area. Now this is wet, so I'm going to put my hand here so that I don't get any droplets on that side. And I'm going to spray a few droplets in the center here. And let's say I want to have just a little bit of white, like some baby's breath or something in there. What I'm going to do is start painting my wash around the outside. And then as I get to where my droplets are, I use a variation of that spritz and drag method and start bringing a little bit of color in and letting it run. So there I have some irregular little lights that I just painted around, and the spray bottle helps me make it nice and soft. Similarly, let's suppose I have some trees that are going to be lighter than the background. I can take a sponge and moisten the paper where my trees are going to be. When I reach the area where the sponging occurred, I get little lights. Now let's let this dry and we'll talk about what would you do with these white areas if you're not going to leave them perfectly white. All right, now all of these are dry. And I want to mention that, of course, any of this could be done over an existing wash. So there could be color on these already. If there's not, and you want to add a tint of color, you can also do that after you have laid your wash. So for example, with my distant skyline, perhaps these skyscrapers are being lit up by the setting sun. And again, it would make sense for me to use a flat brush because it makes those shapes well. Often it's nice to just leave a little bit of white peeking even when you're tinting everything. So there's our skyscrapers have a little sunlight on them, and then as we get down here, they're in shadow. Maybe they have a shadow side sometimes. So that gives you the sense of light up above and shadow down below. I think I want my city in more shadow. For something like this, you can fill this area with water and drop in color. Now, very often, this sort of thing will happen. You'll wind up accidentally going outside, and what I usually do is just rinse my brush, dry it off, soften that edge, and allow that color to blend outward. And that actually usually helps anchor the item in the scene and keep those hard edges from making it appear like a paper cutout. Over here, maybe we'll put a little green in our leaves. So you can just play around with this sort of thing. There's no one way to do it.